Evil rarely announces itself with horns, fire, or thunder. More often it hides in plain sight, dressed in the comfort of ordinary hospitality. In the year 1867, deep in the Ozark hills of Missouri, travelers found themselves drawn to a small wooden cabin along a winding dirt road. To most, it appeared a blessing. Two brothers, quiet and hard-working, offering weary riders fresh water, a warm meal, and even shelter for the night. At first glance, they seemed like the very embodiment of kindness in a world still staggering from the chaos of the Civil War. But as the years passed, whispers began to ripple through the region. Too many travelers stopped there and too few were ever seen again. Wagons were discovered abandoned, horses returned to farms without their riders, and a silence began to hang over the woods around the cabin, as though even the birds understood that something was wrong. The question has lingered for over a century and a half. Was this the work of desperate men, hardened by war and driven by greed? Or was something older, darker, and unexplainable at work? In the post-war South, violence was almost ordinary. Men killed for money, for revenge, even for sport. But the story of the brothers carries details that feel far stranger than simple banditry. Some claimed they had forged a pact with infernal forces, turning the sacred act of hospitality into a ritual of betrayal. Others dismissed such talk as superstition, insisting they were merely criminals who perfected the art of luring their victims with food and water. Yet the contradictions remain. Records tell one story, folklore tells another, and eyewitness accounts only complicate the truth. The Ozarks themselves seem to conspire in the legend. The wilderness was vast, filled with caves, rivers, and old mining shafts. Perfect places to hide secrets or to bury bodies. Some diaries from the era mention strange sights near the cabin. Lights flickering at night, smoke rising when no fire should have been burning, and a well that, according to locals, never froze even in the bitterest winters. These fragments feed into the folklore, suggesting that perhaps what the brothers offered their guests was more than water. It was an initiation into something unnatural, something that blurred the line between murder and ritual. Yet psychologists argue otherwise. They see in this story a case study of trauma and depravity, of young men shaped by violence they could neither escape nor control. Raised in poverty, surrounded by a nation tearing itself apart, did they simply learn cruelty as a survival tactic? Or did they find in cruelty a sense of power the world otherwise denied them? This story is both history and nightmare, grounded in fact yet wrapped in mystery. It is a tale where greed and superstition, violence and ritual, morality and madness collide. And as you hear it, one unsettling truth will become clear. The case of the brothers who served more than water does not resolve. It endures. Perhaps the truth died with them, or perhaps it is still waiting, somewhere in the Ozarks, hidden in the silence of the woods. Evil rarely begins with horns or fire. It begins quietly, with hunger, with silence, with lives that never had the chance to be innocent. To understand the brothers whose names became tangled with fear in the Missouri Ozarks, we must begin not with their crimes but with their origins. Those earliest years when poverty, folklore, and war shaped them into figures who blurred the line between men and myth. The Missouri Ozarks in the mid-19th century were a land of paradox. They offered shelter to those who wished to disappear, hermits, fugitives, the desperate and the unwanted, but they also devoured the weak. The hills were thick with forests that shut out the sun, rivers that rose suddenly and swept away entire wagons, and limestone caves that swallowed sound until it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. For settlers, this wilderness was both a prison and a promise. For children, it was a classroom without mercy. The brothers were born into this place, raised in a cabin that stood miles from the nearest town, surrounded by silence broken only by the cries of animals and the occasional scream carried from some distant skirmish. They grew up in a land where the law was as thin as the soil, and morality was more suggestion than rule. Their father was already the subject of whispers. He was not a learned man, but he was known for strange practices that unsettled even hardened neighbors. Some said he carried a pouch of bones and herbs tied to his belt. Others that he could draw out fever by muttering in a tongue no one recognized. In a region without doctors, such skills could mean life or death. Some praised him as a healer. Others muttered that he was consorting with something unholy, drawing his knowledge from a source no honest man would touch. When livestock sickened or crops failed, it was his name people spat behind closed doors. The brothers watched all this unfold in silence, learning early that suspicion was as constant a companion as hunger. Their mother brought with her another inheritance, one of superstition. Her family had come from Germany, carrying with them old-world traditions that blurred into folklore, half-forgotten songs and whispered warnings. She sang lullabies not in English, but in a dialect older than her children could understand, verses that spoke of rivers demanding offerings, of spirits that lingered between doors, of shadows that must never be called by name. She hammered iron nails above the threshold of the cabin to ward off wandering spirits, and she forbade her sons from whistling after dark, saying it was an invitation they could never rescind. Whether these were harmless remnants of culture or pieces of something more occult, the brothers absorbed them as truth. Their childhood world was not one of clear borders between faith and fear, but a blur where prayer and spell, blessing and curse, seemed almost interchangeable. Poverty was the family's constant companion. The soil was thin and unyielding, crops failed more often than they thrived, and winters carved at the flesh like knives. Their father taught them to trap not only rabbits but stray livestock, to take from the wilderness and from others when desperation demanded it. Their mother boiled bark and roots into thin soups, stretching meals in ways that barely kept death at bay. Hunger was not just a condition, it was a teacher. It whispered lessons about survival, about what could be justified when there was no choice, about how quickly compassion could be discarded when the belly ached long enough. Historians later asked whether hunger had been the first seed of cruelty in the brothers' hearts, or whether that cruelty already existed, waiting for hunger to give it form. Neighbors remembered strange games they played as children, burying dolls in the dirt, staging funerals for birds, staring too long at the stillness of death as though trying to memorize it. One farmer swore he once saw the younger boy lower a cat into a bucket of water, watching it struggle, and then go still, before laughing in a way that sent a shiver colder than the wind. Some dismiss these memories as folklore invented after the fact. Others believe they were the earliest glimpses of the men they would become. Then came the war. Missouri was a battlefield without boundaries. Unlike the neat lines drawn on maps, this was a war fought in ambushes and massacres, in burning barns and bodies left in ditches. The brothers, still barely teenagers, grew up in a storm of violence. They watched as neighbors were hanged from trees for choosing the wrong allegiance. They scavenged from battlefields, pulling boots from corpses and knives from the stiffened hands of the dead. Death was not shocking, it was everywhere. The Civil War taught them what hunger had already suggested, that life was fragile, and that power belonged to those willing to take it. Some psychologists later argued that the war rewired their empathy, numbed them until suffering no longer registered as tragedy, but as opportunity. Others insisted it simply revealed what had always been there, an emptiness inside them that the war merely legitimized. Yet even in those years, their story split into contradictions. For every tale of cruelty, there was another of kindness. One winter, when an orphan nearly froze in the snow, the brothers carried him to their cabin, fed him, and gave him coins for clothes. A farmer swore they helped rebuild his barn after a storm left him ruined. Their mother, until her dying day, insisted her sons were good boys with hard hands but soft hearts. These contradictions became the foundation of their legend. Were they cruel men who occasionally feigned kindness, or decent men gradually undone by a merciless world? Psychologists argue such contradictions are common in sociopathy, where gestures of care are not empathy but acts of control. Folklore insists it was proof of possession. That evil never consumes wholly but allows flickers of innocence before dragging the soul deeper. The detail that unsettled everyone, however, was their obsession with ritualized hospitality. Even as teenagers, they insisted on offering visitors water, setting the cup down carefully with both hands as though performing a rite. Food was served in silence, bread cut evenly, stew ladled as if measured. To neighbors, this seemed oddly formal, strangely rehearsed. It was kindness with the weight of ritual, as though each gesture carried meaning beyond its surface. Psychologists later saw in this the beginnings of a pattern. Hospitality not as generosity, viewed as dominance, a ritual designed to lure, test, and control. What seemed like politeness was in fact theater, a rehearsal for the horrors to come. Religion added another layer of unease. In post-war Missouri, churches were both anchor and weapon, but sermons rarely touched the brothers. Preachers warned that they were the devil's innkeepers, men marked by sin from the womb. Congregations were told not to drink from their hands, not to linger on their land. Yet paradoxically, the community still relied on them, borrowing tools, trading food, accepting their help in times of need. Even the faithful could not fully avoid them. The brothers attended church occasionally, sitting silently at the back, never singing, never praying. One preacher later wrote in his journal that their eyes reflected no light, as though they were windows to an empty house. Whether this was poetic exaggeration or a genuine account of something uncanny is impossible to know. Historians looking back explain the brothers as products of circumstance, poverty, hunger, war, and the collapse of morality in a land without law. Folklore paints them as cursed from the start, doomed by bloodlines and bound to forces beyond human comprehension. The truth perhaps lies between the two, and that very ambiguity is what allowed their legend to endure. If they were only criminals, they would fade into the countless nameless killers history has forgotten. If they were only demons, they would drift into myth. But by standing on the knife's edge between history and horror, they became unforgettable. The Missouri they grew up in offered no compass. Justice was inconsistent. Law bent by wealth and violence. Families armed themselves and trusted no one. Against such a backdrop, morality was not guidance but luxury. The brothers' story then becomes not anomaly but mirror. How many others robbed travelers, lured the vulnerable, buried bodies in secret? The difference perhaps is not in the acts but in the legend that clung to them. By the time they reached adulthood, their reputations were fractured. Some saw them as hard-working men scarred by war. Others swore they were shadows, waiting for the moment when their strange rituals would erupt into monstrosity. The truth, if it existed, was hidden beneath layers of kindness, cruelty, hunger, and silence. And so the central question lingers, as it has for over a century. Were these men doomed from birth? Or did the turbulence of their upbringing bend them into cruelty? Did their bloodline scarf fade into their bones? Or did war and hunger shape them into predators? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was either. Perhaps as the Ozark woods swallowed their voices, the answer was lost forever. The first disappearances never looked like disappearances at all. They began like small cracks in glass, easy Thomas, easy to excuse, until the fractures spread too wide to ignore. In the years just after the Civil War, when Missouri's roads were lined with abandoned homesteads, and the air still carried the smell of burned timber, people vanished often. Soldiers deserted, drifters wandered, families fled debts or hunger and were never heard from again. To vanish in such a time was not unusual. It was expected. And yet in the hills near the brothers' cabin, the pattern was too sharp, too strange to be dismissed as chance. The first name that appears in memory is that of a preacher. He was not a man of wealth or power, only a circuit rider who carried the gospel between towns on horseback, stopping in cabins and barns to speak of God to anyone willing to listen. According to fragments preserved in church ledgers, he had planned to ride west, delivering sermons to communities that had not yet seen a preacher since the war ended. He carried little more than a Bible, a bag of bread, and the stubborn belief that his words could heal a land broken by violence. The last time he was seen alive, he was riding past the brothers' cabin. Witnesses remembered that the brothers had greeted him warmly, offering him water and a meal as was their custom. The preacher accepted. Hospitality was sacred in those hills. To refuse an offered drink was considered both insult and omen, a sign of distrust too heavy to carry among neighbors. Days passed, then weeks. The preacher never arrived at the next settlement. At first, no one worried. Roads were rough, storms frequent, and delays were expected. But then his horse returned. Thin, wild-eyed, and with reins cut cleanly as if by knife. There was no saddle, no rider, no sign of where it had been. That was when whispers began. At first, neighbors spoke only behind doors. Perhaps bandits had taken him. Perhaps he had lost his way and drowned in the river. But others recalled darker details, that the horse's hooves were mud-caked with a clay that matched the soil near the brothers' land, and that the animal seemed terrified of anyone who tried to ride it again. One farmer's diary claimed the horse would buck violently whenever it passed the road to the brothers' cabin, refusing to go nearer. Rational minds dismissed it as coincidence, but coincidence is the seedbed of folklore. Soon, travelers told each other to avoid that stretch of road after dusk, for fear that something there hungered for more than water. If the preacher's disappearance stirred unease, the next vanishing brought fear. It was a family of settlers, 2 parents, 3 children, seen heading west with their wagon loaded high with furniture in hopes of new farmland. The family was last reported dining with the brothers, who provided them with stew and bread before they continued on their way, but they never reached their destination. The wagon was found days later, overturned in a gully, its contents rifled through. The horses were gone, the family gone with them. No bodies were found. The sheriff's records, such as they survive, mention only missing travelers. To a weary official in a county drowning in violence, the report of a lost family was nothing remarkable. But the stories written in nearby diaries speak differently. One woman wrote of finding a child's shoe in the mud near the road, still damp, though no children were living within miles. Another swore she heard screams one night drifting across the hills, sharp and brief, cut off as though smothered. And always there was the rumor of the well. The brothers' property contained a well that locals swore never froze, not even in the harshest winter. Some believed it was fed by a spring too deep to feel the cold. Others said it was because something moved within it, something restless, warming the water from below. A hired hand once claimed that, walking past on a moonless night, he heard sounds rise from it. Not the bubbling of water, but cries, human and anguished, as if the well itself was swallowing voices. He never returned. Whether this was hallucination or truth, the legend of the well became inseparable from the vanishings. The disappearances multiplied. A peddler was the next to vanish, last seen selling trinkets and tinware near the brothers' cabin. A pair of hunters, too, vanished without trace, their dogs returning days later with burrs tangled in their fur and eyes wide with some nameless terror. The sheriff's men occasionally searched the area, but in a land filled with caves, ravines, and dense forests, a body could vanish forever. It was easier to record lost or presumed robbed than to dig into the shadows. What unsettles historians is the pattern of detail that recurs in these early accounts. Always there was the ritual of water. The traveler would stop, be offered a drink, and then linger for a meal. Hospitality, the most sacred of rural traditions, became their weapon. It was an unspoken covenant. The weary could trust the host would protect the guest. To poison that covenant was more than murder. It was sacrilege. Psychologists later described it as a form of predatory theater, where control was gained not through brute force but through the slow weaving of trust. Toby handed a cup of water by the brothers was, according to some, the moment the victim's fate was sealed. Folklore added another layer: the figure of the faceless man. Children in nearby farms began claiming they saw a strange presence near the cabin, a man without a face, or whose face shifted like water, never holding its shape. Some said he lingered at the edge of the woods, others that he walked in the brothers' shadow. Rational minds dismissed this as fear taking shape in children's imaginations. Yet the consistency of the description, appearing in diaries and letters from multiple families, cannot be ignored. Whether hallucination, collective hysteria, or some deeper truth, the faceless man became bound to the story. Was he a spirit bound to the brothers, a vision of their guilt, or merely the imagination of children raised in a climate of terror? The tension between fact and folklore deepened with each telling. In the cold language of official records, only numbers remain: travelers unaccounted for, wagons abandoned, livestock found wandering. But in the warmth of memory where fear shapes words, the stories gained teeth. Bloodied clothing discovered by the roadside, wagon wheels half buried in mud, laughter echoing from the cabin long after midnight. Were these embellishments added later, after the brothers were suspected? Or were they the truths too disturbing to make it into formal reports? Some scholars argue the brothers saw themselves as gatekeepers, twisted arbiters of fate. To them, the offering of water was not hospitality but judgment. Those who drank and stayed were chosen, marked for disappearance. Those who passed by without stopping were spared, not because the brothers lacked appetite, but because to kill without ritual broke the pattern. Others argue it was nothing more than opportunism, the same greed and violence that drove countless robberies on frontier roads. But if so, why the ritual? Why the obsession with turning kindness into a lure? Why did every disappearance circle back to their cabin, as if the land itself demanded sacrifice? By the late 1860s, whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Neighbors avoided the brothers' land after sunset. Some carried charms or crosses when forced to pass by. Travelers were warned to refuse all food and drink near the cabin, though few dared insult the brothers openly. Fear had become survival. And yet the sheriff remained silent. Whether from lack of evidence, fear of the brothers, or complicity in their deeds, no formal charges were ever brought. This silence allowed the disappearances to continue, to feed not only on victims but on the growing imagination of those left behind. What lingers even now is not certainty but unease. The preacher, the family, the peddler, were they slain and buried near the well, their bones feeding roots that spread beneath the earth? Or did they simply fall prey to the chaos of the era, their vanishings woven into a story too dark to resist? Every account circles back to the same chilling refrain: people entered the brothers' cabin and were never seen again. By 1870, the brothers were no longer simply men in a cabin on a lonely Missouri road. They had become something larger, something that haunted the collective mind of the Ozarks. Farmers whispered of them over fence rails, Travelers carried their names as warnings, and preachers thundered against them from pulpits as though denouncing the devil himself. Yet, as the legend grew, so too did the divide between those who clung to reason and those who surrendered to superstition. The brothers stood at the crossroads of both worlds, where science's cold scrutiny met folklore's burning imagination, and neither side could claim full dominion. The scientific voices of the time were rare in those hills, but they existed. Men of medicine, amateur naturalists, and a few wandering geologists sometimes passed through, eager to map the strange limestone country of the Ozarks. To them, the rumors of faceless men, freezing wells, and ghostly screams were no more than the product of isolation and fear. They pointed instead to the peculiar geology of the land: vast limestone caverns, deep underground rivers, and mineral-rich springs. Some even suggested that strange deposits of manganese and other minerals might have seeped into the drinking water, producing mild hallucinations in those who consumed it. Could this, they asked, explain the reports of ghostly lights around the cabin, or the visions of faceless figures stalking the woods? To skeptics, it was a convenient and entirely natural explanation, one that absolved the region of demons and consigned its horrors to chemistry. But for every skeptic's theory, there were a dozen local testimonies that refused to fit within scientific logic. Neighbors recalled meals shared with the brothers where the stew had a metallic taste, as though iron, or blood, had been mixed into the pot. One visitor swore that the broth shimmered strangely in the light, a surface ripple that did not belong to ordinary food. Folklore took these whispers and hardened them into myth. The brothers, it was said, consecrated every meal by mixing blood, animal or human, into their cooking, offering it not to their guests, but to something unseen that fed alongside them. Meals became rituals. Hospitality became sacrifice. Yet when archaeologists unearthed the ground near the supposed site of the cabin a century later, they found no human remains in the cooking pits. No evidence of ritual slaughter, no bones beyond those of livestock and deer. Soil samples revealed ash, traces of cooking fires, and nothing that could confirm the tales of blood-laced feasts. The scientific verdict was clear. Folklore had exaggerated common crimes into monstrous legends. But believers countered with their own certainty, that evil leaves no fingerprints for microscopes, no residue for test tubes. Science cannot measure the devil, one local preacher declared in the 1920s, long after the brothers had faded from record, but not from fear. It can only measure ash, and ash tells you nothing of what burned. This tension, this duel between rational inquiry and raw superstition, formed the marrow of the brothers' legacy. To psychologists examining the story decades later, the truth seemed less supernatural and more human. They spoke of psychopathy layered with trauma, of young men raised in the crucible of border wars where murder was a daily act and cruelty a learned language. In this reading, the brothers' ritual of offering water and food was not mystical at all, but symbolic. By controlling the most primal transaction of trust, eating and drinking, they enacted domination. They created a theater of safety only to shatter it, seizing power not through brute violence alone, but through the deeper violation of trust. The ritual itself, psychologists argued, was the thrill. The killings were almost secondary, yet theology countered this interpretation with its own voice, equally insistent. Could such ritualized hospitality, so inverted and deliberate, truly be explained by mere trauma? Or was it evidence of possession, of a pact with something infernal that delighted in twisting the sacred into the profane? Hospitality, after all, is not only a social contract, but a religious one, rooted in biblical tradition, where welcoming the stranger is akin to welcoming angels unawares. To pervert that into a lure for slaughter was more than psychological cruelty. It was blasphemy in its purest form. To theologians, the brothers were not just killers but vessels, innkeepers of sin, chosen by something older and darker than themselves. By 1870, preachers described them in sermons not as men, but as parables of wickedness. Congregations were warned to see in them the embodiment of unchecked sin, the proof that the devil moved through ordinary faces. Farmers crossing the hills began to hang talismans on their wagons, crossing themselves when passing near the brothers' land, even if only in daylight. What began as rumor had calcified into ritual response, fear not only of crime, but of contagion. Evil, once whispered, became a sickness in the community, something that might spread if not guarded against. Science tried to keep pace, but the hills were unforgiving. The few physicians who visited the region had little evidence beyond hearsay. They collected water from the notorious well and found it no different than any other, though locals swore its depths whispered on cold nights. They examined soil and found only the expected mineral traces of limestone terrain. No proof of curses, no sign of ritual, nothing to substantiate the horror stories that grew with each retelling. And yet, the absence of evidence did not extinguish fear. It fed it. To the locals, science's inability to confirm evil was not Addis proof but a failure. Some truths, they believed, lay beyond the instruments of men. The dichotomy hardened as decades passed. In libraries, the brothers' story became a case study in mass hysteria, folklore exaggerating the ordinary crimes of bandits. In rural churches, it remained a cautionary tale of sin unrepented, of men who dined with the devil and served his feast to strangers. Psychologists wrote papers tracing the impact of war trauma on young men's capacity for empathy, while theologians thundered that no wound of childhood could excuse such ritualized cruelty. Each camp dug trenches, unwilling to yield ground to the other. What complicates the story is the persistence of accounts that defy both camps. Reports of ghostly visions, men without faces, voices echoing from wells, lights moving without fire, continue into the 20th century, long after the cabin had rotted away and the brothers' names faded from record. Are these merely echoes of old stories shaping new imaginations? Or do they suggest that something remained, tethered to the land, indifferent to whether science acknowledged it? Folklore thrives where certainty fails, and in the Ozarks, certainty was a rare commodity. Even archaeology could not settle the matter. Excavations found no mass graves, no evidence of ritual sites, no relics of sacrifice. And yet, every absence only seemed to fuel belief that the brothers' work was not bound by earthly remains. Of course you will not find bones, argued one folklorist. The bones were claimed. What they served was not of this world, so why should you expect to weigh it in yours? Rationalists scoffed, but the argument found fertile soil in communities still scarred by loss, for whom the disappearances were too numerous, too haunting, to be chalked up to coincidence. The brothers became symbols of a broader struggle, the human need to explain horror, to decide whether evil is born in the brain or in the soul. If they were simply opportunistic killers, their crimes fit within the grim logic of post-war banditry. But if they were something more, if their rituals, their twisted hospitality, their faceless companion were real, then they represented a hole in the fabric of reality, a place where hell bled into earth. And between those interpretations, no resolution could be found. As the century turned, newspapers occasionally revived the story, framing it either as a lesson in gullibility or a evidence of the supernatural stubbornness of folklore. Scholars argued over whether the tales of blood and Thestu or cries from the well were embellishments added later to sharpen fear. Skeptics reminded readers that memory is porous, easily reshaped by rumor. Believers countered that truth endures precisely in those shared memories, handed down not because they were false, but because they were too true to silence. Thus, the debate remains unresolved. Science brings its soil tests, its crime reports, its missing persons ledgers. Superstition brings its visions, its omens, its rituals whispered in the dark. Between the two lies the haunting absence of proof, an emptiness that becomes itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that something refuses to be pinned down, whether born of men's cruelty or of forces beyond them. The viewer is left with no easy answer. Were the brothers simply shattered men reenacting domination through symbolic hospitality, or were they vessels of something infernal, using kindness as bait for damnation? Did the geology of the land bend perception into hallucination, or did it serve as the perfect cloak for rituals too ancient to name? Science insists on coincidence, superstition insists on pact, and both leave us with the same chilling truth. People vanished, and no one could explain why. Perhaps the truth lies in both camps, or perhaps in neither. Perhaps the devil wears the mask of trauma to hide his hand, or perhaps trauma is devil enough on its own. What endures is not certainty, but debate. A debate that still echoes whenever one stands in the Ozark Hills, listening to the wind around abandoned wells, wondering whether the silence is only silence, or whether beneath it, something still whispers. The disappearances might have dissolved into whispers, another footnote in Missouri's troubled post-war history, had it not been for the survivors. Rare, few, and often silenced by shame or fear, they stand as living interruptions to the story of the brothers. They are anomalies, proof that some entered the cabin and lived to tell the tale. But their voices do not bring clarity. Instead, they thicken the fog, their words hauntingly consistent yet riddled with contradictions, as though truth itself had been bent in the brothers' presence. One of the earliest accounts comes from a man named Elias Hart, a trader from Kansas City who made his living moving goods through the Ozarks. According to fragments of his later testimony, Elias stopped at the cabin one autumn evening after his horse had gone lame. The brothers welcomed him warmly, offering water, as always, first. Elias claimed that when he lifted the tin cup to his lips, the taste was wrong, not foul but metallic, as though iron had dissolved into the liquid. He pretended to drink, letting it dribble past his chin. Moments later, he noticed the brothers exchange a glance, brief and unreadable, as though confirming something silently between them. He finished his meal in tense silence, feigning gratitude, and left as quickly as his limping horse would allow. Years later, Elias swore that this decision saved his life. "Had I swallowed," he wrote in a shaky hand, "I do not believe I would be writing at all." Another survivor, known only as Tomlinson in church records, told a story far stranger. He claimed to have been given shelter during a storm and led to a barn where he could rest with his wagon. Unable to sleep, he awoke in the night to see the brothers kneeling before what he described as a blackened altar tucked into one corner of the barn. It was little more than a table, scarred with burns, upon which lay bones and shards of pottery. But Tomlinson insisted that the brothers whispered in a tongue he could not understand, rocking gently as though entranced. Terrified, he slipped away before dawn, leaving his wagon behind. He walked 15 miles through the rain before finding safety, and when he later returned with the sheriff, there was no altar, no bones, nothing but dust. Officials dismissed his testimony as dream or drunkenness, but Tomlinson swore until his deathbed that he had seen two men praying to something that was not God. Not all accounts came from direct witnesses. Decades later, descendants of those who once traveled the Ozark roads began telling stories of dreams in which the brothers appeared, offering cups of water filled not with liquid, but with shadow. Children would wake screaming, unable to explain why they felt thirsty but refused to drink. Adults, too, spoke of recurring visions, the cabin door opening, the brothers' voices calm and practiced, and the overwhelming silence that surrounded them. Were these dreams fragments of inherited memory, echoes of trauma passed through generations, or were they evidence that the brothers' reach extended beyond death, into the realm of nightmares where the living could still be touched? What binds these testimonies together is their unsettling consistency. Again and again, survivors describe the silence inside the cabin, not the ordinary quiet of the woods, but an oppressive stillness as though the world itself held its breath. No birdsong outside, no wind against the shutters, no creak of wood. Only the brothers' voices, low and measured, each word deliberate as if rehearsed. One survivor described it as speech within a void, as though sound itself had been swallowed. Psychologists later argued that such descriptions were symptoms of trauma. In moments of fear, memory distorts, exaggerates silence, and sharpens details into symbols. Survivors, in this view, were projecting inner terror outward, shaping their recollections into cinematic narrative. But religious believers heard something else in these accounts. To them, silence was not the trick of fear but the sign of presence. In scripture and folklore alike, silence often precedes the manifestation of the divine, or the demonic. The Lord silences storms, but the devil silences creation, one preacher wrote in 1895, citing the survivors' accounts as testimony, ignored by a society too eager to explain away evil. To believers, the consistency of these testimonies was proof not of trauma, but of truth, a truth officials had refused to face. Historians note, with unease, how many of the survivors soon vanished from records themselves. Elias Hart, after leaving his written statement, disappears from census rolls. Tomlinson lived long enough to be mocked in newspapers as a drunkard before fading from the public eye. Others, whose names appear briefly in court documents or parish notes, simply stop appearing altogether. Did shame silence them? Did fear of ridicule make them retreat into anonymity? Or was there something darker, that the brothers' shadow lingered, reaching beyond their physical acts of violence to erase those who dared speak? The phenomenon of disappearing survivors troubles researchers even now. It suggests either the corrosive effect of rumor, where telling such a story marked one for ridicule, or the possibility that the survivors themselves were targeted again, punished for breaking the silence. And yet, in family stories, their voices persist. Grandchildren whisper of a grandfather who refused to drink from any stranger's cup, or of an aunt who insisted on lighting candles when passing the road near the old cabin site. Memory survives where record does not. Psychologists today interpret survivors' accounts as case studies in trauma's ability to rewrite memory. Fear, they argue, is not stored as a clean recording, but as a jagged, shifting fragment. Survivors who felt powerless before the brothers reconstructed their experiences into narratives of symbols, metallic water, shadow-filled cups, faceless men, that allowed them to process what they endured. In this sense, their stories are less factual records than psychic truths, expressions of terror so deep that reality bent to contain it. But others push back. If trauma reshapes memory into symbols, why are the symbols so consistent? Why do survivors across decades, across families repeat the same images? Silence, shadow, ritual, water that tastes of blood or iron. Coincidence, skeptics insist. Pattern seeking, says science. Yet for those who believe, such repetition is the mark of something real, something that left scars not only on flesh but on the soul of a region. The accounts also deepen the psychological question of power. Why the ritual of water? Why the silence? Survivors describe the brothers not as wild or chaotic, but calm, deliberate, almost priestly in their control. Their hospitality became performance, their voices low and rhythmic, their silence a stage on which the victim's unease played out. Some psychologists interpret this as sadism refined into ritual, the thrill of dominance amplified by ceremony. But theologians interpret it differently, as the behavior of vessels, men whose humanity was dimmed by the force moving through them, reciting rehearsed lines as though dictated by something unseen. The chilling consistency lies also in what survivors describe feeling, a sense not merely of danger, but of inevitability. Elias Hart wrote of knowing, the moment he tasted the metallic water, that he was already counted among the dead. Tomlinson's war, the sight of the brothers at the altar, left him convinced. They had already decided my soul was not mine. To keep. Such language suggests not only fear but fatalism, as though survival was accidental, a crack in the ritual rather than an act of resistance. Survivors did not escape so much as slip through an opening in a script otherwise designed for death. As their voices fade, what remains is contrast. Survivors describe a cinematic world, silence, ritual, visions, while officials left only paperwork, thin, bloodless, unsatisfying. The sheriff's reports note missing travelers without elaboration. Church records mention rumors unbecoming. Newspapers print half-sarcastic references to hungry brothers with long spoons. Between these sterile accounts and the survivors' vivid testimonies lies the gulf that defines the case. Officials offered paperwork. Survivors offered horror. Which is closer to truth? The survivors, though few, sharpen the portrait of the brothers not as mere bandits but as ritualistic predators. They suggest a crime that was not simply robbery but theater, not only murder but performance. Whether viewed as trauma-distorted memories or as testimony of genuine evil, these survivors remind us that the brothers' cabin was not only a crime scene, but a stage. And those who walked away, shaking, thirsty but alive, became unwilling actors in a play they could not forget. But history has little mercy for survivors. Many lived the rest of their lives in obscurity, mocked or ignored, their voices drowned by silence as oppressive as the one they described inside the cabin. Perhaps their erasure was the final cruelty, the proof that to escape the brothers' grasp did not mean to escape their shadow. Their presence lingered, not only in nightmares but in the emptiness left behind. What disturbs most even now is not what survivors revealed, but what remains missing. Their testimonies do not answer the central questions. Were the brothers ritualists or opportunists, demons in flesh or men broken by war? Trauma made symbolic or symbols made flesh? Instead, their words leave us with more silence, more shadow, more unanswered thirst. The story of the brothers did not end with their cabin, nor with the bones, real or imagined, that locals claimed littered their land. As the years passed, the narrative evolved, fragmented and multiplied. Historians, folklorists, psychologists, and theologians each laid claim to their version of events, weaving fact and speculation into a patchwork that only deepened the mystery. At the heart of it all lies one question: who or what were the brothers? Ordinary men hardened by war and desperation, or emissaries of something far older than Missouri's wooded hills? One of the most persistent theories casts the brothers as nothing more than opportunistic killers. To this school of thought, there is no need for devils, cults, or curses. The Civil War had left Missouri scarred. Soldiers returned home with hollow eyes and violent reflexes. Families were shattered by shifting allegiances, fields burned, and homes abandoned. In such a lawless landscape, the temptation of robbery, especially of passing travelers, was immense. Hospitality was both a tradition and a trap. Offering food and water to weary strangers created the perfect setting for ambush. Under this view, the brothers were predators shaped by circumstance, men who learned to cloak greed in ritual. They did not need supernatural aid, only opportunity. The silent survivors described, "It may have been the heavy hush of fear, the stillness of men waiting for the right moment to strike, the metallic taste of the water. A coincidence, perhaps the tang of iron leaching from poorly cleaned cups. But the ordinary killer theory, though neat, leaves gaps. Why did folklore escalate so quickly? Why did locals, accustomed to violence in those turbulent years, elevate these particular men into the stuff of legend? This is where the cult hypothesis enters. According to some accounts, the brothers were not acting alone, nor entirely on human impulse. Their mother's lineage, traced to Germanic settlers, provided fertile ground for speculation. Stories emerged of sects that practiced ritual sacrifice, blending old-world pagan rites with frontier necessity. Could the brothers have inherited such practices? Some believe their rituals of hospitality, the offering of water, the rehearsed stillness, the silence of their cabin, were not mere tools of control, but echoes of a darker liturgy. They were not improvising violence, but enacting ceremony. Folklore in the Ozarks fanned these embers into flame. Tales spread of a well on the property that swallowed not just water, but souls, a bottomless pit where the screams of the lost could still be heard. Travelers whispered of wagons passing the brothers' land at dusk, only to glimpse ghostly riders trailing them, shadows with faces too blurred to recognize. Children invented games where they pretended to drink from invisible cups, daring each other not to scream when silence fell. And always, the water returned as symbol, water that froze no matter the season, water that shimmered with reflections of faces that were not one's own, water that, once swallowed, turned the eyes black. To psychologists, such stories represent the universal language of archetypes. The brothers fit a deep-seated mythic role, the dangerous innkeeper, the treacherous host. Across cultures from ancient Rome to medieval Europe, tales warn of wayfarers lured by false hospitality, of food turned to poison, of lodgings that conceal murder. Even the chalice of communion, sacred in Christian tradition, carries an inverted shadow, the poisoned cup. In this reading, the brothers were not demons but mirrors of the human unconscious, their story retold in symbolic language that transcends time. Survivors, frightened and traumatized, tapped into these archetypes unconsciously, shaping their memories into patterns already familiar to the mind. Folklore did the rest, reinforcing what psychology had planted. Yet this argument, that the story is myth projected onto reality, does little to quiet believers. For if myths repeat across cultures, is it not possible they do so because they are rooted in truth? Legends of blood inns, where travelers were murdered for profit or sacrifice, stretch from the highways of medieval Europe to the forests of Asia. The brothers may have been America's echo of that ancient rhythm. If myth emerges again and again, perhaps it is because humanity is not inventing stories but uncovering patterns, patterns too dark to be dismissed as coincidence. The cult hypothesis gains further weight when one considers the reports of ritualistic elements, silence, rehearsed speech, the supposed altar in the barn. Skeptics argue, these are distortions, hallucinations shaped by fear or later embellishment. But cult theorists see them as fragments of something larger, a ceremonial framework that survivors only glimpsed. Was the water laced with herbs, hallucinogens that induced visions? Was the silence imposed deliberately, rehearsed to create dread and simulate the uncanny? Ritual, after all, thrives on repetition, and survivors described just that, a sense of performance, of script. To cult theorists, the brothers were not merely killers, but officiants in a tradition meant to sanctify violence. Philosophers take a different path. To them, the brothers represent the question of evil itself. Were they inherently monstrous, born with something broken inside, or were they victims of their age? If war, famine, and isolation stripped them of empathy, then the brothers were not other but kin, our reflection in harsher circumstances. In this view, to demonize them is to absolve ourselves, to pretend they were unique rather than a symptom of society's collapse. If any man can be stripped down to violence by hunger and grief, then the brothers were not aberrations, they were inevitabilities. But if that is true, then the boundary between us and them dissolves. Evil ceases to be an external invader and becomes an internal potential, lurking in every human heart. And yet even within philosophy another current runs. Some insist the brothers cannot be explained by circumstance alone. Too much precision, too much ritual, Too much darkness lingers around their story. To these thinkers, evil is not simply absence of good, nor merely a psychological wound. It is active, alive, and capable of entering men. The brothers, then, were vessels. Their cruelty not only their own but magnified by a force that thrives wherever order collapses. This interpretation returns us to theology, to the devil's innkeepers, men whose kindness was never theirs but a mask worn by something far older, patient and watchful in the woods. Modern skeptics attempt to cut through these webs of myth and theory. Forensic tests conducted a century later on soil samples from the site revealed only traces of ash, bone, and animal remains. Nothing conclusively human, nothing ritualistic. Crime reports, such as they are, record only missing travelers. Diaries and oral testimonies, though compelling, remain inconsistent and impossible to verify. From this perspective, the brothers were likely ordinary thieves whose crimes were exaggerated over time, transformed by storytelling into horror. In this sense, the true story is not of demons or cults, but of how communities process fear, by magnifying it into legend. But even the skeptics struggle with certain details. Why do accounts of silence recur so consistently? Why does the imagery of water persist, echoing through generations, appearing in dreams and folklore alike? Why do survivors vanish from record as though their testimony itself carried a curse? Dismissing these as coincidence feels unsatisfying, yet embracing them as supernatural feels indulgent. This tension, unresolved, is precisely what keeps the brothers' story alive. As the decades wore on, myths only expanded. Some claim the brothers never died, that they linger still in the hills, offering water to lost hunters and hikers. Others said the cabin was cursed ground, where animals refused to graze and travelers grew disoriented. Folklorists collected tales of ghostly figures leading riders astray, of wells that glowed at night, of whispers in the woods that grew louder the longer one listened. These myths, untethered from fact, still circle back to the same imagery: water, silence, ritual. Perhaps this is why the case endures. Each theory, historical, psychological, theological, folkloric, offers a fragment of truth, but none resolves the whole. To call the brothers opportunistic killers does not explain the myth. To call them cultists does not explain the silence. To call them archetypes does not explain the evidence, however scant. To call them vessels of evil does not satisfy science. Truth scatters like shards, and the viewer, the reader, the listener, is left to assemble meaning from fragments that will never fully fit. This scattering of truth mirrors the human struggle itself. We crave certainty, yet reality slips into myth the moment it is told. Were the brothers reflections of human cruelty, or doors through which something darker stepped? Theories multiply, myths magnify, and memory, always treacherous, refuses to deliver clarity. Perhaps that is the true horror, not that we cannot decide what the brothers were, but that their ambiguity forces us to question what we ourselves are capable of. In the end, the brothers stand not only as figures of history but as mirrors of fear. They are what we make of them. Bandits, cultists, archetypes, demons. Each interpretation comforts and disturbs in equal measure. Each theory reflects not the brothers themselves, but the anxieties of those who tell the story, and perhaps that is why the tale endures. For in the silence of their cabin, in the shadow of their ritual, we glimpse not only their faces but our own. The cabin is gone, its logs swallowed by time, its hearth buried beneath weeds. Nothing physical remains, no bones, no wagon wheels, no written confessions. And yet the absence feels heavier than presence. For ruins can be explained, catalogued, put to rest. But a vanished place leaves only silence, and silence invites imagination to whisper. The fate of the brothers is just as murky. Some say they were lynched by neighbors who had heard too many rumors, their bodies swinging from an oak tree that no longer stands. Others insist they fled into the forests, their shadows still lingering in the Ozark hills. A handful of historians even claim records show unnamed men surfacing in Arkansas in the 1870s, living quiet, unremarkable lives under assumed names. But no grave was ever found, no death certificate recorded. Like their victims, they simply disappeared. And so their story endures, not in ledgers or law books, but in the tales that have outlived them. Historians call it folklore, dismissing the darker embellishments as fear passed down through generations. Psychologists argue that the survivors and locals, living in the trauma of a violent, fractured society, reshaped memory into narrative. Totham, the brothers were not demons, but mirrors of a community struggling to explain random cruelty. Yet believers continue to see something more. A wound left open, evidence that evil does not die, only changes its mask. Perhaps the brothers were nothing more than opportunistic killers, exploiting the chaos of post-Civil War Missouri to prey on those too tired or too trusting to resist. That explanation would place them alongside countless other nameless criminals who haunted America's frontier roads. But if that were true, why do their shadows still linger when so many others have faded? Why does their name evoke dread a century and a half later, when ordinary bandits are forgotten? Folklore refuses to release its grip. It insists there was something uncanny in their rituals. Water that tasted wrong, silence that felt staged, kindness sharpened into cruelty. The image of travelers lifting a cup and never being seen again has become more than a crime story. It has become an archetype, a warning, a parable. Water, the symbol of life and trust, turned into betrayal. Hospitality, the bedrock of survival in a dangerous world, twisted into ambush. The brothers are remembered not only as murderers, but as corrupters of trust itself. And that may be the truest horror of all. Not whether they served a devil, or performed rituals, or acted on trauma, but that they transformed something sacred into something terrifying. Their silence, their vanished cabin, their unresolved fate, all point to a question without answer. Were they merely men who chose cruelty? Or did they become something else entirely, something that still lingers in the hills of Missouri, waiting for the next weary traveler to stop for water? The case remains unresolved, as haunting today as it was in 1867. Perhaps the truth lies buried in the soil, perhaps it waits at the bottom of a well, and perhaps on some lonely road the next cup you're offered will not be water at all.